Welcome to a special episode of Rocking Our Prayers. Today, I'd like to discuss one of the greatest social changes of the 20th century, the rise of working motherhood. You see, 150 or even 100 years ago, women's work was poorly paid and socially stigmatized. But now it is widespread and socially accepted that women work and mother. But social change has been notably asymmetric because despite encroaching upon male-dominated domains and paid work in the public sphere, women continue to do the lion's share of care work. Why is this? Well, to find out, we are lucky enough to have 3 fabulous new books. Breadwinner by Emma Griffin, An Intimate History of the Victorian Economy. Double Lives by Helen McCarthy, A History of Working Motherhood. And Making Motherhood Work. Oh, is that working too much reflection? Making Motherhood Work by Caitlin Collins. So let's dive right in. So before the Industrial Revolution, men and women were economically interdependent, working together in a shared enterprise, a cottage industry at the home. Women played an important, productive role. And men needed women to survive. They relied on women's labour power. But that changed with the Industrial Revolution. From 1830, there was a rise in real wages, but those earnings were monopolised by men. And, as Emma Griffin shows in Breadwinner, that radically changed family relations. And she shows this by drawing on over 600 working class autobiographies written by men and women born between 1830 and 1903. So these autobiographies really help us understand how men and women perceived and experienced the world, their concerns and constraints, what they took for granted or challenged. It's quite enlightening. So our central question is, well, what caused the male breadwinner model? And going into this book, I wasn't really sure. Was it that women didn't want to work due to the cult of domesticity, or was there simply low demand? Now, here's where the autobiographies are really useful. Teenage girls desperately wanted paid work. They wanted to go out, to have economic autonomy, to join the public sphere and the conviviality, gain pride in their contributions. I mean, factory work was grueling, relentless, dangerous, but it was preferable to the relentless drudgery of care work, which confined them to the home and provided no reward. However, due to sex discrimination in the labour market and women's low earnings, their parents didn't consider it worthwhile, given the large volume of housework. So instead, girls were saddled with the childcare of younger siblings, scrubbing floors. Meanwhile, their brothers went out, earning their own money, gaining pride in new skills, and being valued as important financial contributors to the home. So it was owing to sex discrimination in the labour market that women needed to marry in order to survive. But marriage was no guarantee of economic security because men were distinctly unreliable. So even though wages shot up, that did not lift all boats. Actually, men retained discretionary power over how that income would be distributed within the home. And this rise in real wages also amplified patriarchy because men and women were no longer so interdependent. It endowed men and men alone with pride, status, and authority. But I have 2 lingering questions. First, what about regional economic geography? Because the male breadwinner model was not nationwide. Actually, married women's employment responded to demand, as Cui Shen-Yu shows in a recent article in Economic History Review. In cotton areas like Lancashire, demand was high and female and married women's employment was high, regardless of their husband's wages, regardless of their own domestic burdens. Meanwhile, in pit villages, women were indeed dependent on men. So although Emma Griffin highlights heterogeneity within the working class, not all men were unreliable, I ask, what about place? Because it's not just about our individual characteristics. We develop our aspirations, our beliefs, our expectations by observing the communities around us, our towns and cities. And there was this radical heterogeneity across Britain. So I wonder, how did living in a place with a high prevalence of female employment shape gender relations in those communities? I wonder. My second question is, even if women's wages were relatively low, why didn't families value that additional income? Why did women's labour supply not shoot up in response to this rising demand for labour? Because there was a rising demand for labour, and we see that in the rising real wages. Because in other parts of the world, even in really patriarchal societies with marked gender pay gaps and huge volumes of housework, women's employment increased with industrialisation. Look at Tsarist Russia, Japan's silk mills, Korea and Taiwan. Women's employment all increased with industrialisation. So I wonder, what is different about Europe such that women's employment did not increase during that period? So, those are my lingering questions. Now, so we end with this conundrum. 1900, married women's work was socially stigmatised. They were seen as abandoning their children, jeopardising their children's health and education and development. Moreover, a woman working indicated a man's failure to provide. He was not fulfilling his appropriate role as a breadwinner. It was shameful, embarrassing. But now, married women work and have children. It's normal, socially accepted. What changed? That is the key question of Double Lives by Helen McCarthy. And her argument is that everything changed with the post-war economic boom. This economic growth catalysed a growth in demand for services. The rise of the welfare state spawned demand for teachers, nurses, social workers. And competitive consumerism, desire to keep up with the Joneses, motivated women to search for that additional income. And because of labour shortages, employers eagerly recruited more women, and they waived earlier marriage bars to get women into the workforce. And as relative earnings increased, women increasingly responded to those economic opportunities. They pursued education, careers. They became doctors, lawyers, managers. I think an additional factor, perhaps downplayed by McCarthy, is also the rise of part-time employment, because that enabled women to better juggle care and paid work. But I have a question. How and why did mothers' identities change over the 20th century? Because in the early and mid-20th century, women's labour supply was very sensitive to economic conditions. So it depended on the kinds of earnings they could get and their husband's wages. And there was a satisfaction point. If their husband was earning enough, they might not work at all. But in the late 20th century, something changed. Women worked, regardless of economic conditions. Let me rephrase that for economists. Women's own wage elasticity halved between 1980 and 2000, as shown by Blau and Kahn in the USA. Women's labour supply also became less responsive to their husbands' wages and more critical to their own identities, as Claudia Goldin shows in The Quiet Revolution. So I wonder, what happened? You see, McCarthy seems to treat rates of female employment and social acceptance as conjoined twins. But I'm not so sure they go together at the same time or for the same reasons. For me, looking at the data, there seems to actually be a two-step process. So, if there's a macroeconomic change, if there's a rise in demand for women's work, then behaviour changes, and husbands see their wives' work as advantageous given economic conditions. However, attitudes may not change. He may see himself as the rightful breadwinner. Moreover, co-workers may resent women's encroachments into their terrain and give women a hard time through sexual harassment, etc. So it's only, my understanding, through prolonged exposure to a multitude of women demonstrating their equal competence in the workforce, in socially valued domains, and public debates and militant activism, that we see this belated cultural change. And although these two may be associated in Britain, in Europe, that's actually, that connection is not automatic. And Stephan Klasen shows this in the latest issue of World Development. He looks at World Value Survey data, showing that in many low and middle income countries, the male breadwinner ideology is remarkably persistent. So there's a survey, there's a couple of questions actually, in World Value Survey data, whereby they say, if jobs are scarce, then men have more right to a job. And if a woman earns more than her husband, it's bound to cause problems. Do you agree? And actually, most attitudes have been remarkably stagnant in many low and middle income countries. An exception is Latin America. So why is this? And it's really important because if women's work is not broadly accepted, then rising female employment can actually trigger violent patriarchal backlash. Let me give two examples. In the 1990s in rural Kenya, women's work became crucial to household survival. But men reacted in hostile and violent ways, as shown by Margrethe Silberschmidt in her book, Women Forget That Men Are Masters. Another example is Eveteasing in South Asia. As women increasingly joined the public sphere, education, employment from the 1970s, men often responded with sexual harassment, policing the public sphere, trying to push them out of their domain. And if women's employment is not fundamental to their own identities, it may actually recede as male earnings increase. Look at China. Women's work shot up under communism, very high rates of female employment, but World Value Survey data shows a markedly high ideology of the male breadwinner. 40% agree with the two questions I mentioned earlier, and that hasn't changed from 1995 to date. So, in the 2000s, as male earnings increased, women actually retreated from the labour force. Another fascinating example is Japan. Japan, post-war economic boom, rising consumerism and a welfare state, rising demand for services, all the conditions identified as critical by McCarthy. However, the male breadwinner model is remarkably persistent in thought and in practice in Japan. So what was different? So my point here is that we cannot assume rates of female employment and social acceptance happen at the same time or for the same reasons. So I think we need to unravel that a little bit. I mean, then McCarthy ends with a challenge. That even though there's broad acceptance of working motherhood, women still bear the lion's share of care work. And that double burden has a huge class dimension. Poorer women, because of this huge burden of care work, which they can't procure services for a nanny to help them out, for instance, remain trapped in low status, poorly paid, precarious, flexible employment. So why is this? And why hasn't it changed? I mean, as McCarthy shows, the 1970s, feminist activism, militant activism, and public debates were enormously important in enabling women to recognise that their individual problems were actually collective and structural. But still the double burden persists of women doing the lion's share of care work. Why is this? Now, some argue that the division of labour, the gender division of labour, just reflects women's inherent preferences, to quote Catherine Hakim. Now, to interrogate this claim, Caitlin Collins, prop. Caitlin Collins, sorry, can you see that the light reflection is too bad? I'm sorry. Caitlin Collins interrogates this claim by doing comparative qualitative research in 4 different countries: Sweden, Germany, the USA and UK. And she does this because she wants to understand, how does government policy shape individuals' expectations and behaviour? And her work is really enlightening. Let me actually read a quote. This is from one of her middle-class American informants. "I'm doing everything subpar." And that narrative was common in her sample. So her American participants tended to blame themselves for their failures to do it all. Never seeing any government agencies providing care, they took private responsibility for child rearing, adopting individual coping strategies, pumping at their desks. So instead of resenting or complaining or demanding better, they bore the burden of the lack of workplace support and demanding employers. Whereas in Sweden, 83% think that government agencies should be the primary providers of preschooler care. Why is this? Well, the care is affordable, high quality, and everyone does it. It's normal, expected, a shame to miss out. So by showing how individual preferences, expectations and behaviour are mediated by family-friendly policies or lack thereof, for me, Collins's argument really quash ideas about women's inherent preferences. Actually, they respond to institutions. Now, Collins has another argument that I'm a little bit sceptical of, but let's hear what you think. She argues that American women are trapped in a negative feedback loop. Never seeing better, they don't contemplate or let alone demand more. And if only American women could envision collectivist solutions, then they would surely demand and relentlessly mobilise until they could secure the same. I'm not so sure. I'm not so optimistic for 2 reasons. One is the USA's culture of economic individualism and a traditionally stingy welfare state. Second, even when women have experienced collectivist solutions and seen benefits, that doesn't guarantee the survival of those institutions. Just look at the former Soviet Union. So I have that moment of disquiet. But let me know in the comments what you think. Maybe I'm just too pessimistic. Right, let me summarise the 3 books. So, the overarching argument is about the rise and fall of the male breadwinner model. And we have seen growing social acceptance of female employment. But this change has been asymmetric. And it will continue to do so if women blame themselves for failing to do it all in the absence of family-friendly government policies. Now, my meta-contributions have been twofold. First, to push for more subnational, and second, to push for more international comparisons. So while I love that Collins shows how government policies shape individual behaviour, what I'd really like to see is more comparisons between the rural and urban in Sweden, or between cotton areas and pit villages in industrialising Britain. Second, I would love these brilliant scholars to explore other world regions, because I think that forces us to ask more questions, to finesse our analysis about the single country case study. Well, thank you so much for listening. This was just an experiment, my video review. I hope it was fun, you enjoyed it, and it rocked your prize a little.